Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. Emmanuel Levinas was an important philosopher and Jewish thinker who taught and wrote in France during the latter half of the 20th century. Levinas's philosophical works engaged with many ideas and thinkers within the continental tradition, and he is widely considered one of the great contributors of his era to ethical philosophy, among other things. In addition to this, he also made important contributions to Jewish thought in his day, through his wide-ranging essays on the subject and also, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, his discourses on sections of the Talmud. Levinas's intersecting contributions to both general philosophy and Jewish thought make him a fascinating subject for discussion. Fortunately, to lead us in this discussion of Levinas's conceptual world, we have joining us today Dr. Sarah Hammerschlag, who is a professor of religion and literature, philosophy of religions, and history of Judaism at the University of Chicago. Professor Hammerschlag has published widely in the field of religion and literature, and especially on the post-World War II French intellectual scene. Among her writings on this subject is her 2016 work, Broken Tablets, Levinas, Derrida, and the Literary Afterlife of Religion, published by Columbia, a book that shall no doubt play a prominent role in our discussion today. It is a pleasure to welcome her to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor Hammerschlag, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Let's dive in and talk about Levinas. But before we do, let us address a little bit of his background and also the general intellectual tradition within which he wrote and taught. So firstly, let's address a little bit the general issue of French Jewish thought. So I want to ask, is there such a thing as a French tradition of Jewish thought? If so, what does it look like? What are the circumstances, political, social, intellectual circumstances that gave rise to and characterize French Jewish thought?
Yeah, I think there is a tradition of French Jewish thought, which isn't to say that it's homogenous, but I think probably the first thing to say is that it's important to note that the Jewish community in France was the largest continental European community of Jews after World War II. So one way to think about the contribution of French Jewish thought is that it gives us an opportunity to understand what Weimar German Jewish thought, what its continuation would look like had it had a chance to continue. So there's a great deal in the post-war French Jewish canon that's responding to people like Buber and Rosenzweig. Certainly Levinas is responding to both of them. But it's also important to say that it has its own history before that, and that it's distinct, and that some of that history impacts the way in which the post-war world of it unfolded. So, probably worth saying that the Jews in France were the first really to be fully emancipated in Europe as a consequence of the French Revolution. And then under Napoleon's organizing of the Sanhedrin, there was a lot that was canonized in some sense about what French Jewish thought would look like. And so under Napoleon's regime, the consistory system was started. And this is an unusual thing about French Judaism because it meant that it had a very strict hierarchy. There was a Grand Rabbin of France, and each city had its own great rabbi, and that insofar as these figures were in some sense responsible to the French state, there is a way in which certainly in the 19th century, French Jewish thought was a French production. And so what you see in 19th century French Jewish thought is this sort of dialogue between the Jewish tradition and French Republican values. And one of the ways you see that is the kind of claim that, in fact, the prophetic tradition or the covenant is actually the sort of earliest form of Republican values, and that Republican values are a kind of instantiation of these Jewish ideals. There's sort of claims back and forth that both suggest that Judaism has something to say back to France, but also that France can learn from the Jewish tradition if it wants to instantiate its ideas in the best way possible. I think the other real contribution is an institutional contribution beyond the consistory system, which has to do with the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was really the first major international aid organization. And I think it's impossible to underestimate how much the establishment of this organization in the 19th century impacted the shape of modern Judaism today, because one of the major things that this organization did was start schools all over the Mediterranean basin. So as a consequence, you had French-speaking Jews all over North Africa and in the Middle East. And it, in many ways, created a kind of colonial context because these Jews were inculcated into a kind of colonial mentality by virtue of these schools. And so it separated out Jews from Muslims in ways that, we're just sort of beginning to sort out the ramifications of that.
Fascinating. And would you say that the bulk of the French Jewish tradition was that? How was that affected by the war? Meaning, was it something that primarily flowered after World War II, and because of it, was there a great interruption in it, or were there continuations from pre or post war, or all of the above?
I mean, I think what I would say is that the point of continuity that marks the connection between the post-war French Jewish thought and pre-war French Jewish thought is this obsession with universalism, because I think that the ideal of universalism is so intrinsic to the idea of the Republic, to the idea of revolutionary rhetoric. And so it shifts enormously the way in which that notion of Jewish universalism gets articulated. But I think that's probably the greatest point of continuity. The greatest point of discontinuity has to do with the sense of abandonment, this sense of betrayal. It's not just the Germans who came into France, right? It was like the Vichy regime instituted its own anti-Jewish race laws. And so the sense in which French Jews had felt that they were fully French, or at least some of them. I mean, some of them lost that sense as a consequence of the Dreyfus Affair, but many, I think, into the 30s certainly felt that Judaism was a religion. It was a confession, like on the analogous to Protestantism and Catholicism. And with the rescinding of those rights, many French Jews had to strongly rethink what the synthesis was between their Jewishness and their Frenchness. And so I think of post-war French Jewish thought as essentially a long conversation about how to re-articulate that sense of identity.
Fascinating. Perhaps one day we'll have to do an entire episode on this, because just scratching the surface certainly whets the appetite. But let us for today dive into our main hero for today, which is, of course, Emmanuel Levinas, an important thinker both within the Jewish and general philosophical world. Could you perhaps give us a bit of a background, his life, his times, the major events, etc.?
Sure, yeah, I can try. I mean, I should say that I haven't worked on Levinas for about 10 years. So this is sort of like, and I still teach him sometimes, but this is sort of taking me back to earlier research. But he was born in Kovno, Lithuania in 1906. And he went to a Russian gymnasium, but he did come from a Jewish home that was observant. And he certainly learned to read Hebrew as a kid. I think it's pretty clear that he didn't have a real yeshiva education. And when he went to Strasbourg for university, and part of that was a consequence of the Russian Revolution, the desire for his parents to get him into Western Europe. And so then his education from that point forward, his university education was in France, and he was naturalized as a French citizen already in the 1930s. So in Strasbourg, was interested in philosophy right away, and at first in the kind of forms of psychologism. And from there, he found phenomenology. And in 1928, 1929, he went to study with Husserl and then Heidegger in Freiburg. And this was really what revolutionized his thinking. It's probably worth saying, though, that already at Strasbourg was where he made his acquaintance with Maurice Blanchot, who would be a lifelong friend and interlocutor. And it was very much Len Levinas who kind of introduced Heidegger. Well, Levinas really introduced Heidegger's thought and Husserl's thought really to France. First of all, by translating the Cartesian Meditations, and then by writing, his thesis was published in French. And so, for example, famously, Sartre only learned about Husserl by means of Levinas's book. After being in Strasbourg, he came back to Paris, and he was working for the Alliance Israélite Universelle and publishing a decent amount in the 1930s, already some essays on Judaism, already some essays on phenomenology. And after 33, it's certainly, Heidegger's Nazism that seems to alter his philosophical trajectory. And so by 34, 35, you can see him essentially trying to figure out what to do with phenomenology such that he can find a way out of the Heideggerian situation, in a way, outside of the question of being. In 1940, he's mobilized by the French army and captured outside Rennes. And in 1942, he ends up in a stalag in northern Germany. And he spends the rest of the war in essentially a labor camp for Jewish prisoners of war. So he had certain protections as a consequence of being a prisoner of war, but also Jews were separated out from Germans. And during that time, he kept extensive notebooks. And so we can see how his thought transformed during that time. And he says in Existence and Existence, which is his first major publication upon his return, essentially that he was in the Stalag, and he I mean, I'll just read to you what he says on the first page, because it's an interesting way of parsing what that experience did for him. He said these studies began before the war were continued and written down for the most part in captivity. The Stalag is evoked here not as a guarantee of profundity, nor as a claim to indulgence, but as an explanation for the absence of any consideration of those philosophical works published with so much impact between 1940 and 1945. Probably there he's talking about Sartre's being in nothingness. He was writing notes on being in nothingness himself in the camps, and then comes back to find Sartre is famous and has essentially taken a version of phenomenology to the French public. So he doesn't have a university position until 1961 with the publication of his Habilitationsschrift, which is Totality Infinity. Before that, he continues to work for the Alliance, and he is, for much of that time, director of ENIO, the École Normale Israélite Orientale, which was a high school, lycée, that trained the teachers from these Alliance schools all over the Mediterranean basin. Now, before the war, the education of that school had essentially functioned to inculcate French values to these teachers. Under Levinas's leadership, that begins to shift, and particularly because so many North African Jews are either emigrating to Israel or emigrating to France, and so the sort of function of these schools is many of them are not returning to North Africa, obviously, and so the very function of the school changes. But in 61, he starts teaching in Poitiers, in 67 in Nanterre, and in 73 and he's at the Sorbonne. And so, between the publication of Totality Infinity and being in Time in 1974, I mean, he begins to become something of a star, and his sort of true philosophical reach extends. In terms of the Jewish community, he is participating in a series of colloquia. So there was a series of colloquia that were organized starting in 1957, and he's a leader of that colloquia. And the colloquia essentially are organized. It's a colloquia of French-speaking Jewish intellectuals, and the idea behind this colloquia is to really reconsider what European Jewish thought will look like in the wake of World War II. And he dies in 1995, and he had Alzheimer's at the end of his life, which has led to it's led to a very exacerbated court case between his children over the sense of his legacy. So,
well, that's a tad unfortunate. By the way, one detail from his biography I always found fascinating was the one that you mentioned, that for a large part of his career, he was actually a headmaster, essentially. He was director of a high school, which I think of all the professions that philosophers down the centuries have had, that actually is one of the most interesting, and perhaps, afforded him at least an insight into perhaps human nature, or I don't know, perhaps even ethics, that there were, denied others who didn't have such a sustained interaction with adolescents, with teenagers. I think that's a fascinating dimension.
yeah, I'll add one thing to that, which is just a kind of funny tidbit, which I think illustrates what you're suggesting, which is, so one of the things I've done is look through the Alliance's archives pretty extensively. And I mean, I find it amusing that amidst the correspondence about ideas, you find correspondence about like whether they can get kosher wine, or what the menu is going to be like for the next week, or what the class setup is for each year. So you see him having to cope with all of the sort of mundane issues of running a secondary school, even as we remember him as having all of these great and profound thoughts.
Interesting. Yeah, I suppose that sounds like a challenge for anyone, even the Levinas. Anyway, but moving on. I mean, before we get into the Jewish elements of his thought, I would like to ask about his more basic philosophical positions. And the most famous one, I suppose, is what is sometimes described as an ethics as first philosophy, or a philosophy of the other. So, could you perhaps outline this for us? What was this basic ethical philosophy of Levinas? What did it look like, and also, to what did it stand in opposition?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'm going to start with the latter part of that question first, because I think it's one of the things that a lot of students of Levinas miss, which is that I think to read him correctly, you can't begin with totality and infinity. You have to begin with existence and existence, or even De la Vision, which was published in 1935. And so to go back to De la Vision, what you find there is the sense in which Western philosophy has actually failed to achieve the transcendence that it claims to achieve. That in fact, Western philosophy the model of consciousness always brings us back to ourselves. And one of his examples is the fact that we claim that the mind and we claim a kind of Cartesian dualism, but in fact, all one has to do is experience something like nausea to understand that the body is itself fundamentally inescapable. And he sees, in fact, like Nazism or a Hitlerian philosophy, he uses that term and then rejects it later. He doesn't want to use the term philosophy in relation to something Hitlerian, but he sees that as a kind of return to paganism, and he thinks that Nietzsche is the source of it. That's certainly debatable, but he sees in that form of paganism the realization that the only way to achieve a kind of universalism that's not about the spirit is actually through the concept of expansion. That this sort of territorial expansion becomes the manifestation of the universal under fascism. And he essentially names as his problem the question of how does one get to transcendence if not through reason? And so I would say that to think about what ethics as first philosophy means is it's an answer to the question, is there some other way in which we experience transcendence that's not by way of reason? And essentially he argues that the mind, and this of course is going back to a kind of Husserlian idea of intentionality, that the mind goes out and reaches out into the world and it takes back what it has in terms of the concept, and that sort of brings it back to its sort of cabinet of self-consciousness. But in so doing, it just reabsorbs and consumes, some almost like eating, the world that it encounters. And so the world never says no to my powers until one has a face-to-face encounter, a true face-to-face encounter. And a true face-to-face encounter for him is the realization that in the face of the other person is not something that can be absorbed, consumed, understood. That there is a form of transcendence that I experience in the face of the other. And insofar as that says no to my powers, it also sends me back in such a way that my intentionality is no longer a viable mode of relation. And so the ethical relation becomes the only viable mode of relation. Instead of, I can think you, one has to say, what can I do for you? How can I be responsible for you? And there's a sense in which that transcendence also brings back a concept of heteronomy. So if Immanuel Kant was concerned with making ethics about autonomy, Emmanuel Levinas is about making ethics about heteronomy, the experience of the heteronomy of the other human being.
Interesting. And I suppose the main point is that even one doesn't have to know a great deal about the other in order to have an obligation towards them, I suppose. This is something that binds you.
No, in fact, knowledge is not the mode by which the face-to-face relation functions. In fact, it's the saying no to knowledge as a mode. Insofar as I know things about the other, in fact, I'm not encountering them as other. Insofar as I can describe you, that's a failure of a face-to-face relation.
And for Levinas, it was specifically the face that was most important, or I don't know, the portal, the great representation of something. What is this? Because he does mention, what is the role of the human face in this encounter?
I mean, I guess the way I think about it is that it has, phenomenologically, is that it has a great deal to do with the eyes of the other. That it has to do with the fact that I cannot get behind and know what you think of me. And in that sense, he says that's where he starts to talk about God. That's where he starts to talk about the laity of God, in the sense in which I experience a divine pastness in relationship to the other person's face. So their unknowability points towards a transcendence that is in itself for him divine. And so what is it about the face? It is the sort of sense in which another consciousness is not something that can be cognized.
Interesting. Okay, fine. We'll leave that particular part there, even though as tempting as it is to dive into, because I want to get to his Jewish thought, the area of his Jewish thought. And as an introduction to this, I mean, I suppose, could you perhaps answer more biographically, what was Levinas's introduction into the realm of Jewish ideas? How extensive was his education? With whom was he interacting? What was the nature of his engagement with Judaism? even before we get to the very ideas, sort of where did it come from and to what end was it applied?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to separate out lore from fact in this regard. I mean, I think that the major encounter that he claims marked his thought about Judaism was an encounter with a man named Shushani. And Shushani certainly existed. I've met many people who've met him. He was a kind of roving Talmud prodigy already in the late 20s and 30s. Elie Wiesel met him and wrote about him. And Levinas had a friend, Dr. Nearson, who introduced Levinas to him. And he lived in Levinas' school for quite a few years. And Levinas claims to have studied with him. I mean, and for me, this is like, why is it partially lore? Because there's something about being able to connect the idea of Jewish knowledge to this kind of sage figure who didn't himself leave behind a written canon that seems to give his own sort of Jewish credibility, like some sort of site that can't really be investigated, right? Now, I mean, I've talked to a number of students of his from Enyo who and asked about his sense of Jewish knowledge, and they will say, many of them say, that it's clear that he was interacting with all of these students who had more traditional Sephardic Mizrahi upbringings in Northern Europe, and that he didn't have the kind of same depth of kind of traditional knowledge that some of his own students had. And that, I mean, and again, some of this is based on interviews, so I mean, how much credibility you want to give to it, but I mean, that there was a slight insecurity about that in his Rashi courses. So he gave these courses on Saturday that eventually all of Paris went to, but they were essentially study courses, Talmud study courses. So yeah, I mean, we're not talking about somebody who had a yeshiva education, and of course, this has been a way in which his Talmudic readings have been critiqued, that they don't read like something from a rabbinic master. They're deeply philosophically inflected. But I think there's more to say about that, which we can talk about later.
Right. So let me ask you the following, because we actually did an episode shortly a while ago about Herman Cohen, for instance, and discussed the nature of his understanding of God and the way in which that came from his ethical framework, or at least an ethical intuition that he had. And I'd like to ask if one could say a similar thing about Levinas, meaning was his conception of God or conception of religion, let's say, did that stem from his first philosophy, his ethical confrontation with the other, or was it something else? Meaning, how does one characterize Levinas's, let's say, core religious beliefs in relation to his first principle or first philosophy?
I mean, I don't think that's actually not the easiest question to answer. I mean, in some sense, it would involve me giving you my own version of what I think the role of theology is for him. I think one of the things to say is that so much of his Jewish thought takes place within the context of this colloquium of French-speaking Jewish intellectuals, right? And so one of the things he does in that context a lot is emphasize the importance of what he calls the square letters, because he's talking to people like Vladimir Jankelevich, who are very much philosophically educated and don't understand the Hebrew idiom. So he ends up being a voice within a very particular context for return to the Hebrew texts, right? What does that say about his relationship to God? I mean, I think there are ways in which one could say he's an atheist. I think there are ways in which one could say that he's not an atheist. I mean, because I think for him, it's important that what's important about God is insofar as it gives credence to the idea of the transcendence of the face of the other. And what is important about Judaism is the claim that from its earliest texts, it does instantiate what he thinks is the idea of this ethical relationship. And so he will read the traditions through that sense, and he will find it even where you might not think it's so findable.
Right. That's okay. That's a fair answer, and I guess that doesn't necessarily say that much about God's existence, but relevance outside of the ethical sphere. I mean, does his understanding of God influence or come from, or I suppose influence anything else? In other words, as you say, it gives meaning or it gives basis to the transcendence of the face of the other. does it do anything else for him? I
I
mean,
mean,
I do not. I can't phrase the question less crudely than that.
no, yeah. No, I don't think it does. I mean, I don't think he has a.
Okay.
I think if anything comes to take the place of God is having a kind of profoundly um, foundational function for him, it's more the Jewish people. And I think you start to see that in the 50s and 60s in his thought. It's the idea of the Jewish people, and it's the idea of being a witness to the prophetic tradition. It's not like he has a strong idea of providence. It's like he wrote about Maimonides, but it's not like he doesn't have that understanding of the way in which God relates to prophecy. Yeah. I mean, I think there are reasons why some people would characterize him as an atheist. I mean, the reason why I wouldn't has to do with the conversation that took place between he and Blanchot, insofar as for Blanchot, insofar as the alternative, the other, shouldn't be founded in the transcendence of God, then that for him changes the way in which that the other is in a position that's higher than mine, right? So Levinas is very clear that he's not Buber, that like the face-to-face relation is not the I and thou, and that has to do with the transcendence of the other person. So does a notion of divinity ground that? Yes, but that's the strongest claim I think that you can make.
Interesting. Okay, fair enough. Let's move on slightly to something else you mentioned earlier, which was his universalism, I suppose. And of course, Levinas did address this this tension, which I suppose almost all Jewish thinkers have to address on some level, which is that between particularity and universalism, particularly as it pertains to the Jewish people. So I guess the question is, how and to what extent did Levinas navigate this? To what extent did he see Jewishness or Judaism as facing outwards, as something that did have a message for the world or did have a relevance for the world at large? Or to what degree did he view it as something addressed specifically for the Jewish people, or something that was particularistic in a manner that, irreducibly so? And I guess then the follow-up question would be, how did he practically apply this? Because of course he was writing and thinking in the days of the establishment of the state of Israel and the continued existence of diasporic Jewish communities, etc. So how did that map on to his more, let's say, political ideas?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the opening of our conversation, I think that it's fair to say about French Jewish thought that it is maybe more preoccupied by the question of universalism than any other Jewish tradition. And I do think that has to do with the nature of how the emancipation took place. And Levinas is certainly a consequence of that tradition in this sense. I don't think, and I think he's always speaking to a world beyond the Jewish community, even in writings given at the colloque. So I think that the sense in which exemplarity, Jewish exemplarity, the idea that the Jewish people stand for a moral ideal, is fundamental to absolutely everything that he wrote. I don't think he's interested in the Jewish community, quad-Jewish community. He's interested in what he can use. Well, he's interested in the Jewish community's relationship to Western Europe, and he's interested in the idea that in a post-Holocaust world, when Western reason has suddenly shown itself to be unable to keep barbarism at bay, that Judaism is fundamental to the future of the world.
Was there any element, you think, in Levinas's Jewish writings that can be characterized as particularistic, or as facing inwards, as attempting to argue for a kind of Judaism specifically for Jews, or a message that Judaism would bring to the Jewish community that wouldn't bring to anyone else? Is there anything within Judaism, according to Levinas, that is for Jews and no one else?
Interesting. I mean, so of course his work is very much divided into these two canons, a philosophical canon and a canon of Jewish writings. And so, it's also important when you look at his Jewish writings to think about the fact that often these were written for Jewish newspapers, but, French Jewish newspapers. So certainly there are ways in which he's speaking to the Jewish community specifically in those writings. And he's encouraging return to textual study, for one thing. And he is changing his vision of Zionism at the same time. So, let me say a little bit more about that. I think, we have a letter that he wrote to Blanchot in 1948 on the establishment of the State of Israel, in which he kind of laments the fact that there's now going to be this Jewish state. He thinks there's a kind of sadness around the fact that like now Jews are going to have a national anthem and an army. And he, I think, is anxious that it's impossible for statehood and this ideal of moral exemplarity and the kind of passivity that in some sense that involves to go hand in hand. And so one of the things we see worked out in his Jewish writings between 48 and the early 80s is a kind of changing relationship to the state of Israel and a kind of like experimentation in how he understands the state to be the future of Judaism. And he says things like maybe the only future for a people at this time is through statehood. Maybe statehood is the only way for a people to essentially explore their own canon, their own culture. And he certainly comes around to that. And we see it taking various forms. I would say on the one hand, he's doing this sort of two things at once. On the one hand, he's trying to argue for a kind of Judeo-Christian tradition and Judaism as its ultimate moral high point. Christianity is having all of these failures, which make it not meet a Jewish standard. And at the same time, he's trying to understand the state of Israel as a beleaguered nation that itself is the victim of a certain kind of Western hegemony, and to work out a defense of the state by virtue of that status as beleaguered nation. And so he's flip-flopping back and forth between both of those endeavors.
Interesting. And is there a discernible tension in his thought between as you say, on the one hand, he laments the Jewish state, presumably because it, in his mind, reduces Judaism or Jewishness to a certain nationality, to a flag, to an anthem, etc., that sort of thing. And that's, again, not particularly unusual for diasporic thinkers, post-war. But also, as you say, perhaps acknowledging the necessity of this. I mean, is there a sense in his writings that this is an unavoidable clash, or at least a tension that must be dealt with?
Yeah, I think the tension is all over his writing, but not always expressed as such. I guess the way I read the tension is in his claim that essentially, insofar as Israel is a state that has the Jewish idea at its center, that is essentially, that could be understood as a conflict between the demands of statehood and the demands of this ethical exemplarity. But for him, the way he works out that tension is essentially to argue that that is what will make the state great, insofar as, unlike other states, it will always have to live out this sort of demand of conscience, right? And because he's already set up Judaism as a form of universalism, insofar as that universalism is instantiated in this tiny state, he then goes as far as to suggest that the protection of this state is not just the responsibility of Jews, it's actually the responsibility of all people, because this state has this role to play for humanity. And that's when he sort of crosses over into a kind of disparaging, in some sense, of the Palestinian counterclaim, or he honors Sadat for the Camp David talks because he sees Sadat as in some way honoring the great mission of the state of Israel at that moment. So the way in which that conflict gets expressed for him is actually to sort of heighten his loyalty, strangely, to the state because it is the site of conflict. And you see that particularly in the essays, the later essays, and in Beyond the Verse, I'd say, is one of the places in which you see that worked out most clearly.
Fascinating. There is okay, and this tension, I think, neatly leads us into our next subject that I want to broach, which is Levinas on the Talmud, because I think perhaps a tad unusually for a very universalistic thinker, Levinas was very interested in the Babylonian Talmud. He read it, he taught it, he wrote essays on it. And I suppose I want to ask him, firstly, why was he interested in the Talmud? Secondly, is there a discernible methodology, a Levinasian way of reading the Talmud? And thirdly, I mean, what does he get out of it? What is it about? What does he see in these Talmudic passages, in these excerpts that he focuses on. How does that contribute to his overall intellectual project?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Judaism for Levinas is always already rabbinic Judaism. So I don't think he really thinks that there is such a thing as Judaism until there's the Pharisaic consciousness. And so, one of the places you see this, for example, is in this famous essay he wrote against Simone Weil, because, Simone Weil was famously saw the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament as nationalistic and violent. And he condemns her for not knowing enough about the Jewish tradition. But he also says very clearly, let me just read to you some what he says, because it's actually encapsulates this quite well. He says, to be a Jew is to believe in the intelligence of the Pharisees and their masters. It is through the Talmud's intelligence that we accede to the Bible's faith. In many ways, Judaism begins with the Talmud for him. It is rabbinic Judaism, right? So for him, there is no other Judaism. So the Talmud is the text by which one encounters Judaism. So we should begin with that. But what does it mean for him to read it or study it? I mean, if you look at his Talmudic essays, he always begins with the Mishnah, and he always gives a description of it and an analysis of it, and then he gives an analysis of the Gemara. So it's not like he's not doing a kind of reading of a page or a passage of Talmud, but that is followed by a kind of philosophical exegesis. And he says in the introduction to the four Talmudic lectures, the first four Talmudic lectures, that the tradition kind of accrues all of this sort of detritus. And he says you kind of have to rub the text. You have to rub the text to like reignite its philosophical message. So he's not interested in the historical debates. He's not interested in the details. He's interested in recovering from it what he sees as its philosophical principle.
I see. Is this not? I mean, just to, again, perhaps just my own biases, but it seems to me that many who try and talk of a universalist, some sort of universalistic message that Jews and Judaism has for the world, typically goes back to the Hebrew Bible, because it's precisely that book that did make its way through the world, right? It was interpreted through the Christian lens, but nonetheless, it's been read by thinkers and philosophers since time immemorial, and it's quoted by every great writer. And its cultural impact is massive. It's just, is it not curious that it is the Talmud, which was so disparaged and so much shunted aside by non-Jewish cultures within Europe, that Levinas precisely tries to hang his hat on, I suppose, in terms of trying to deduce religious messages from it. Do you think that was a purposeful move on his part, or was it just something that came naturally to him? I'm very curious. A universalist Jewish thinker who grabs onto the Talmud as the ultimate exemplar is very unusual to my mind.
Well, one of the funniest and most famous things he said at the colloque about this was in relationship to André Neher. So André Neher, who is another French Jewish writer who was a biblical scholar, who at the colloque gave biblical interpretations at each meeting, he said to Derrida, when Derrida came to visit the colloque, he said, you see, Neher, he's the Protestant, I'm the Catholic. So, I think for him, there is this sense that it is the rabbinic tradition in its diasporic origins that will also be the means by which to recover a kind of diasporic Jewishness. Now, that Jewishness for him is diasporic, not just in the sense that it's about whether you live in Israel, whether you live in the diaspora. It's about a relation to power. It's about a relation to violence. It's about a mode of thinking. And it's about the possibility for tradition to recreate itself and to invite innovation, to invite an exchange of ideas, and to be democratic in certain ways. I think there are ways in which many see, going back to the oven of Aknai, the Talmud as a kind of site in which a kind of democratic Jewishness gets instantiated.
And that would appeal to Levinas, presumably.
Yeah.
Okay, so having discussed a little bit about his Talmudic interests, I'm curious about the following. When you read the rest of Levinas's philosophy, do you see any influence or any imprint from his Talmudic interests? Are there any examples, let's say, of, Talmudic logic or rabbinic concepts or anything which you think he imports from his interest in the Talmud, which you can see throughout his more general thought, or are his interests siloed off one from another?
Okay, so I'm going to actually give a slightly more complicated answer to that than I intended. I think the place where you would see it is insofar as he understands tradition as something that unfolds through generations. I think he has a concept of reception that is rabbinic in nature. I think that the idea that the one who's speaking in a classroom is still participating in the revelation at Mount Sinai. That's kind of the closest you could come, I think, to see. And so he has an essay on revelation interpretation in which you can see a principle of interpretation that I think he himself understood as rabbinic. When you say Talmudic, I assume you mean something about a kind of logic of argumentation. And in that sense, I would say the answer is no. I mean, when I first got interested in understanding the Talmudic readings, it was when I read the introduction to the four Talmudic lessons, and I thought to myself, how does he get to say that? I mean, the question of why did he think he had the right to read the Talmud such that what one could do, and he says this essentially, is to rub away the kind of arcane literary quality to make the philosophical emerge. My question was, what makes him think that that's something that he can do? And I think that audacity is the audacity that you see in his Talmudic readings. Now, many people have written on this better than I have, but I do think that doesn't mean that there's not an attention to the detail of the Mishnah and the Gemara in the readings themselves. I think there is an attention to revealing the scriptural references, for example, to uncovering them, to working through the logic of the metaphors. But I don't think that means that first of all, he wasn't trained classically in the yeshiva. So I do not think that means that he uses a yeshiva mode of thinking when he participates in philosophical inquiry, to put it, bluntly.
Right. Interesting. Does he? I guess a follow up. Conceptually, does he quote Talmudic or rabbinic sources in more general philosophy? Do we see any imprint of that at all, or is Talmud something that he thinks can philosophy be brought into Talmud, but not vice versa?
He quotes rabbis occasionally. He'll quote somebody like Rabbi Gamliel or something. Yeah, so there are references, certainly. And there are many scriptural references, but there are also references from Dostoevsky, right? Probably more references from Dostoevsky than there is from any Talmudic passage.
Interesting. Okay, fair enough. I want to ask you a question which is perhaps something that many historians don't like, which is trying to square the biographical with the intellectual. But to what extent can we see Levinas's ideas as an outworking of his experiences during the war? Because you mentioned the war time for him was particularly difficult. He was a sort of in a sort of worker labor camp. He saw his own country being taken over, but not only by the Nazis, but also by a large portion of Frenchmen who, supported the Nazis and enacted the Nazi agenda. And to what degree can one see later philosophies as a sort of theoretical outworking of his own Holocaust experiences?
I mean, I should say I'm an intellectual historian, so I have less trouble with that line of inquiry than maybe somebody who's a philosopher. And so actually a fair amount of my writing and thought has been tracing the ideas in the notebooks as they emerge in the philosophical work. So yeah, I think you can draw a direct line. I think the easiest way to put it is to think about the exigency of the project as arriving out of the realization that ethics in a Hegelian, right, let's say morality in a Hegelian sense. Let's say the idea that there's a social and cultural aspect to the way in which a culture organizes its moral principles. The idea that kind of concept of morality, or even an Aristotelian notion, the idea that kind of morality is actually much more fragile. He realized at that moment. He has this image in the notebooks
that appears in later essays as well. And it's a sentiment about the idea that when the Nazis invaded, it was like he watched civilization pack itself up like a carnival tent. And this image is the image that stays with me for thinking about why it was that he devoted himself to this idea of ethics as first philosophy. Because it's the sense that, like, we think of morals and social mores as being encoded in laws and customs. And the sense in which it could just evaporate like that, it could just pick up and leave town, brought for him the exigency of the demand that one find another source for ethical thought.
You had to find a source for ethics that was not cultural or social. And so the revelation of the face as the site of that heteronomy and ultimately responsibility is an answer to that demand. At the same time, you see other things in the notebooks. I mean, one of the things that's fascinated me is these kind of like notes where you can see him thinking, can I do for Judaism essentially what Heidegger has done for Germanity, or Léon Blois, for example, the French theologian philosopher. He asks whether there's a way to kind of write a phenomenology of Judaism, and he's reading Rosenzweig, and there are notes from that in the notebooks. So it's not just the experience of suffering creates a demand, it's also that it is the space, it is the laboratory in which he begins to work out his ideas. And so you can trace that from those notebooks forward into the way they emerge in the more mature philosophical writings.
Interesting. And let's finally, let's turn a little bit to Levinas's legacy. Because, you've published not only on Levinas, but on French Jewish thinkers who came after him. And I'm a little bit curious, to what extent can one speak of, let's say, a Levinasian school within the French Jewish tradition? Were there those who saw themselves as very much within his orbit of influence or continuing in his footsteps? And were there those who responded negatively as well? So what is sort of the afterlife as a French Jewish thinker of Levinas, and what were the reverberations of his thoughts among later thinkers?
I mean, there's a number of ways to answer this. I mean, just to give you an anecdotal answer, when I was doing research at the Alliance Israélite Universelle many years ago, and I was in the library all the time, and so the director invited me to their Hanukkah party, and at their Hanukkah party, the first person that the director invoked was Levinas. In some sense, he had become the kind of spirit of the Alliance, and in many ways, the Alliance has become the spirit of French Judaism. So there's that answer. There's the answer that his imprints on the colloquium I mentioned, the colloquium of French-speaking Jewish intellectuals, that colloquium very much he was in many ways the intellectual architect of it. He was the mainstay, and people came to hear him. And so there is a sense in which that whole mode of thinking, I think, is owed not entirely to him, to André Neher, certainly, and to others, but he is responsible for the form that it took, the idea that one can think with Jewish texts about contemporary problems. Those were more social and cultural answers about French Judaism. In terms of philosophically, there was in fact a kind of school that understood itself as Levinasian. It didn't last all that long, but it was founded by Benny Lévy, Alain Finkielkraut, and Bernard-Henri Lévy. And I can't remember which year they ended up kind of passing the mantle, but there were a series of years they met in Jerusalem. I think they met in Paris. They now meet in Paris, but now it has very little to do with Levinas, in which there was a kind of concerted effort to continue a kind of thinking. Now, Benny Lévy, Alain Finkielkraut, and Bernard-Henri Lévy are not the same thinkers, right? They're all kind of extreme in their own interesting way. But did they understand themselves as following from his project? Certainly. And Finkielkraut has made it very clear the way in which he sees himself as following from his project. And Benny Lévy did for a period as well. Now, that is one lineage that kind of very directly wanted to claim the mantle of Levinasian thought. At the same time, the history that I have traced out in my own work follows a different trajectory. It follows from the friendship between Levinas and Blanchot and the reception of Levinas's ideas in Maurice Blanchot's writing and then ultimately in Jacques Derrida's writing. In that latter camp, you have a desire to undo some of the Jewish resonance of his thinking and also to take even the idea of difference and alterity in a direction that is in many ways textual rather than ethical. But at the same time, Derrida never ceased to articulate his sense of debt to Levinas as a thinker.
Interesting. Okay, and the final question that I want to get to, which is something I asked many of my guests just as almost a throwaway line, is, if you could have the opportunity to sit with him, with Levinas tonight, over dinner, and spend some time with him, what would you be asking him? What topics of conversation would you broach? Are there some unanswered questions or unbroached issues, perhaps in your own writing, which you feel could use some clarification? What would you say to Levinas, given the opportunity?
It's funny because I'm working on a different project now where I'm working on a writer, Susan Talbis. And the thing about Susan Talbis is that she was Jakob Talbis's wife. She did actually, like in the 1950s, she was often a dinner guest at the Levinas house. And so it's sort of fascinating to kind of trace the conversations that they were having and to think, in some ways, I think those conversations, I mean, their conversations ended up being about Simone Weil, which is not what my conversations would be about. But I think my conversations would be about the relationship between his philosophical thought and a kind of notion of Jewish community, and why the project to read ethics as tied to the Jewish tradition is something he fought so long and hard for, when there are so many reasons to want to differentiate the revelation of the faith from a Jewish scriptural tradition. Yeah, I think that's what I would want to talk through. And then, of course, I'd want to talk to him about his changing relationship to the state of Israel, because I think that, in 1948, he has this moment of kind of lament that the idea that the Jewish tradition would take the form of a state. And yet he transforms that over the next 30 years. And I would love to hear him think through the logic of that. And I would be curious in this current moment, where his own political sympathies would be.
Those are all very, not legitimate, but fascinating questions, and if only one could have such an opportunity, but for the time being we'll have to rely on the evidence we have. Okay, Professor Sarah Hammerschlag, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This has been a fascinating conversation on a great thinker, and we look forward to the writings that you'll produce in the future and further discoveries to be made in the field. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing how all of this comes together for you, and to looking at your other podcast episodes, which I haven't looked at yet. So,
this has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.